The war had come to Australia's doorstep long before anyone in Canberra wanted to admit it. On December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft screamed down upon Pearl Harbor, the illusion of distance shattered. Australia, that vast island continent at the bottom of the world, suddenly felt very small, very exposed, and very alone. For generations, Australians had placed their faith in the British Empire, believing that the might of the Royal Navy would shield them from any threat. But Britain was fighting for its own survival against Nazi Germany. The fortress of Singapore, that supposedly impregnable bastion of British power in Southeast Asia, was about to reveal itself as a costly mirage. Prime Minister John Curtin stood in his office in Melbourne, reading the cables that arrived with increasing urgency through January 1942. Singapore was under siege. The Japanese were advancing through Malaya with a speed that defied every military projection. British commanders had assured Australia that Singapore could hold for months, perhaps indefinitely. Curtin had staked his nation's security on that promise. Now, as he watched the reports pile up on his desk, he understood with cold clarity that his country was about to face the greatest existential threat in its short history. The fall of Singapore came on February 15, 1942. Over 80,000 Allied troops surrendered to a Japanese force less than half their size. It was the largest capitulation in British military history, and it sent shockwaves through Australia. In living rooms across Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, families gathered around wireless sets and listened to the news with mounting dread. The Japanese weren't just winning, they were unstoppable. General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Australia in March 1942, having escaped from the Philippines with the promise that he would return. He brought with him American prestige and the skeleton of what might become a formidable defensive force. But he also brought sobering assessments. In private meetings with Australian military commanders, MacArthur made it clear, Australia was vulnerable, critically so. The northern coast stretched for thousands of miles, much of it empty bushland and isolated settlements. The Japanese had already demonstrated their ability to project power across vast oceanic distances. If they chose to invade, stopping them would require resources Australia simply didn't have. The attacks began that same month. On February 19, 1942, Japanese carrier aircraft struck Darwin in the Northern Territory. It was the largest attack ever mounted by a foreign power on Australian soil. Over 240 aircraft dropped tons of explosives on the harbor and airfield. Ships exploded. Buildings collapsed. Hundreds died in the fires and chaos that followed. The psychological impact was immense. Darwin wasn't some distant outpost in Europe or Asia. This was Australia itself, under direct assault. But Darwin was just the beginning. Through March and April, Japanese aircraft and submarines continued their assault on northern Australia. Broome, Townsville, and Wyndham all felt the sting of Japanese bombs. Submarines prowled the eastern coast, sinking ships within sight of Sydney Harbor. The war had truly arrived. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters was engaged in fierce debate. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, argued for a conservative strategy focused on consolidating gains in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. But there were others, more aggressive voices, who saw Australia as the key to ultimate victory. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of the Army's most influential and ruthless strategists, pressed for Operation FS, the invasion and occupation of Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia, which would isolate Australia from American support. Some went further, advocating for a direct invasion of the Australian continent itself. The strategic logic was compelling. Australia served as the primary base for Allied operations in the Southwest Pacific. MacArthur was building his forces there for an eventual counteroffensive. Australian factories were producing munitions, vehicles, and supplies for the Allied war effort. Australian and American airfields threatened Japanese positions throughout the region. If Japan could neutralize Australia, either through invasion or by cutting it off completely, the path to dominating the Pacific would be clear. The plan that emerged in the spring of 1942 was designated Operation Centrifugal Force. It called for seizing Port Moresby in New Guinea, establishing a chain of bases through the Solomon Islands, and preparing for a potential invasion of Australia's northern coast if circumstances proved favorable. The operation would begin in May with a naval thrust toward Port Moresby, protected by Japan's carrier fleet. That thrust came to a sudden halt in the Coral Sea. From May 4 through May 8, 1942, American and Japanese carrier forces clashed in the first naval battle in history where opposing ships never came within sight of each other. Aircraft did all the fighting, launched from flight decks hundreds of miles apart. The Japanese sank the American carrier Lexington and damaged the Yorktown. But they lost the light carrier Shoho and had two fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, put out of action. More importantly, the invasion convoy turned back. Port Moresby remained in Allied hands. 1 month later, everything changed again at Midway. In early June, Yamamoto gambled everything on drawing out and destroying what remained of the American carrier fleet. Instead, American dive bombers caught 3 Japanese fleet carriers refueling and rearming their aircraft on deck. In 5 minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were transformed into burning wrecks. Hiryu followed hours later. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of irreplaceable pilots, and the strategic initiative it had held since Pearl Harbor. After Midway, the debate in Tokyo shifted. The Army still pushed for aggressive operations in the Pacific, but the Navy, bloodied and cautious, argued for a defensive perimeter. Resources were finite. Every soldier sent to garrison remote Pacific islands was a soldier not available for the massive war in China or potential operations against the Soviet Union. The window for invading Australia, if it had ever truly existed, was rapidly closing. By August 1942, American Marines were landing on Guadalcanal, beginning a brutal campaign that would drag on for 6 months and drain Japanese resources. The war had turned into a grinding attritional struggle, and Japan was on the defensive. The planned invasions of Fiji and New Caledonia were shelved. Operation FS died in planning rooms in Tokyo. Australia, while still under threat from air raids and submarine attacks, would not face a full-scale invasion. But in the spring of 1942, for a few critical weeks, that outcome was far from certain. The decisions made in Tokyo, the battles fought in the Coral Sea and at Midway, these were the pivots upon which Australia's fate turned. Had any of them gone differently, the story that followed might have been very different indeed. And in one timeline, a timeline of what might have been, those decisions did go differently. The divergence point came not with a grand decision in Tokyo, but with a series of small, seemingly inconsequential changes that cascaded into something far larger. In our timeline, Japanese intelligence failed to locate the American carriers before the Battle of Midway. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo launched his strike against Midway Island itself, leaving his carriers vulnerable with aircraft on deck when American dive bombers appeared overhead. But in this alternate timeline, a single reconnaissance float plane from the cruiser Tone, delayed by a catapult malfunction in our reality, launched on schedule. At 7:28 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the pilot spotted the American task force and radioed its position immediately. Nagumo had the information he desperately needed, and he had it 30 critical minutes earlier than in our timeline. Those 30 minutes allowed him to land his Midway strike force, rearm with anti-ship weapons, and launch a coordinated attack against the American carriers before they could strike his own fleet. When American dive bombers arrived over the Japanese carriers at 10:20 a.m., they found combat air patrols waiting and the decks clear of refueling aircraft. The Americans pressed their attacks with suicidal courage, but the results were devastating for the Americans. The USS Enterprise took 3 bomb hits and was left dead in the water, burning. The Yorktown, already damaged from the Coral Sea, took 2 more torpedoes and began listing heavily. The Hornet managed to launch a partial strike that damaged the carrier Kaga, but Japanese dive bombers found her hours later and sent her to the bottom. By nightfall on June 4th, the American carrier fleet in the Pacific had been effectively destroyed. Admiral Raymond Spruance, recognizing the disaster unfolding, ordered a retreat. The Japanese owned the Pacific. The news reached Tokyo like an electric shock. Emperor Hirohito himself expressed satisfaction at the victory. But more importantly, the balance of power in the Imperial General Headquarters shifted dramatically. The Navy's cautious voices, advocating for a defensive perimeter, were drowned out by the triumphant Army officers who had been proven correct in their aggressive stance. Japan had won the decisive battle. Now was the time to press the advantage while the enemy was reeling. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo convened an emergency meeting on June 8, 1942. Around the table sat the most powerful men in Japan: General Hajime Sugiyama, Chief of the Army General Staff, Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff, and Colonel Tsuji, whose influence far exceeded his rank. The question was simple: What next? Australia, Suji said, spreading maps across the table. We have destroyed their protectors. The Americans have no carriers left in the Pacific. MacArthur has perhaps 3 divisions of combat-ready troops, scattered across a continent the size of the United States. The northern coast is practically undefended. We take Darwin, establish air supremacy over northern Australia, and the entire continent becomes untenable for Allied operations. Admiral Nagano was skeptical. An invasion of Australia would require enormous resources. Ships, troops, supplies, all stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. And for what purpose? To garrison another massive territory. Not to garrison, Suji replied, his eyes bright with certainty. To neutralize. We don't need to occupy all of Australia. We take the north, we establish a defensive line across the narrow part of the continent, and we cut Australia off from the war. Without Australian bases, the Americans have nowhere to stage their counteroffensive. Without Australian resources, they lose access to food, raw materials, and manpower. We force them to negotiate, or we push them back to Hawaii and beyond. General Sugiyama nodded slowly. The army can provide the troops. The 16th Army from the Dutch East Indies, the 17th Army from Rabaul. We consolidate them under a single command and strike within 2 months. But we need the Navy's commitment. The debate continued for 3 days. Charts were examined, logistics calculated, risks assessed. In the end, the decisive factor was timing. If Japan waited, America would rebuild its carrier fleet. If Japan waited, the defensive perimeter would calcify into a static line that could be ground down by superior Allied production. But if Japan struck now, while the enemy was weak and demoralized, the entire trajectory of the war could be altered. On June 11, 1942, the Imperial General Headquarters issued the order. Operation Southern Cross would commence on August 15th. The objective, the invasion and occupation of Northern Australia. The Japanese began assembling the largest invasion force in their history. From ports across the Dutch East Indies, Indochina, and the Philippines, transports gathered. The 5th Division, veterans of the Malaya Campaign, would form the spearhead. The 18th Division, fresh from victories in Burma, would follow. In total, 70,000 troops of the Imperial Japanese Army would participate in the first wave, with another 50,000 earmarked as reinforcements. Admiral Inoue would command the naval forces, 4 fleet carriers, 3 battleships, and over 60 destroyers and cruisers to escort and support the invasion. The target was a 3-pronged assault. The main force would strike Darwin, seizing the port and airfields. A secondary force would land at Broome on the northwest coast. A third, smaller force would secure Wyndham and the surrounding territory. Once these strongpoints were established, Japanese engineers would rapidly construct airfields, allowing land-based aircraft to dominate the skies over northern Australia. The defenders would be given a choice: withdraw south and cede the territory, or stand and be destroyed. In Australia, intelligence reports began arriving through July that something major was building. Radio intercepts suggested large-scale troop movements. Reconnaissance aircraft spotted increasing numbers of ships in Indonesian ports, but the exact target remained unclear. Was it Port Moresby again? New Caledonia? Perhaps an attack on the east coast? John Curtin faced an impossible situation. He had fewer than 3 full-strength divisions to defend an entire continent. Most of Australia's experienced troops were still overseas, in North Africa, in the Middle East, fighting for Britain. He had begged for their return, even breaking with Churchill publicly in a desperate newspaper article where he declared that Australia looked to America, not Britain, for its salvation. Some units had returned, but not enough. Never enough. MacArthur, now Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, assessed the situation with cold military logic. He had requested 6 American divisions to defend Australia. He had been given parts of 2. The 32nd Infantry Division was still training and nowhere near combat ready. The 41st Infantry Division was scattered across defensive positions. He had some Australian militia units, undertrained and under-equipped. Against a determined Japanese invasion, these forces would be insufficient. On August 10th, Australian Coast Watcher on a remote island north of Darwin spotted the invasion fleet. Over 200 ships, moving south in precise formation. He radioed the sighting, then watched as Japanese aircraft spotted his position and strafed his hilltop observation post. He died before his transmission ended, but the message got through. The warning gave Australia 5 days. 5 days to reposition what troops they had. 5 days to evacuate civilians from Darwin and other northern towns. 5 days to prepare for an invasion that military planners had war-gamed and found nearly impossible to stop. MacArthur flew to Darwin personally on August 13th, inspecting the defenses that his commanders had managed to scrape together. The 4th Australian Infantry Battalion held the town itself, supported by some American artillery units and a handful of obsolete aircraft. Minefields had been laid along the beaches. Defensive positions dug into the red earth. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. That night, MacArthur stood on the Darwin Wharf, looking north across the Timor Sea. Somewhere out there in the darkness, the Japanese fleet was coming. He thought of the Philippines, of Bataan and Corregidor, of the promises he had made and failed to keep. He had sworn he would return to the Philippines. But first, he would have to survive Australia. He turned to the Australian brigadier standing beside him. Tomorrow, they'll come with everything they have. Our job isn't to stop them. We can't. Our job is to make them bleed for every yard, to buy time for reinforcements to arrive, to prove that this continent won't fall easily. The brigadier nodded grimly. We'll give them a fight they won't forget, sir. Yes, MacArthur said quietly. Yes, we will. The sun rose on August 15th, 1942, over a calm sea. By noon, the horizon was filled with ships. By evening, Northern Australia was at war in a way it had never experienced before. The invasion had begun, and with it, a new and terrible chapter in World War II. One that would reshape the Pacific, test Australia to its breaking point, and alter the course of history itself. If this alternate history has you hooked, don't forget to subscribe. We're exploring the moments where history balanced on a knife's edge and could have fallen either way. The Japanese bombardment began at dawn on August 15, 1942, and it was unlike anything Australia had ever witnessed. Carrier aircraft struck first, wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes screaming down on Darwin's defenses. The few Australian and American fighters that managed to get airborne were quickly overwhelmed by Japanese Zeros. By mid-morning, the sky belonged to Japan. Then came the battleships, moving into range and unleashing their massive guns on the coastal fortifications. 14-inch shells turned defensive positions into craters. Buildings collapsed. Fires spread through the town. And then, as the bombardment reached its crescendo, the landing craft began their run to shore. The 4th Australian Infantry Battalion fought with desperate courage. They held the beaches as long as they could, inflicting casualties on the first waves of Japanese troops struggling through the surf. Australian machine gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. Snipers picked off officers. Mortars rained down on the landing zones. But it wasn't enough. The Japanese had overwhelming numbers and complete air superiority. By nightfall, they had secured a beachhead 3 miles wide and were pushing inland. MacArthur had positioned his limited forces with care. He knew he couldn't hold Darwin. The town was a death trap, indefensible against the force arrayed against it. Instead, he established a defensive line 20 miles south, anchored on rough terrain and prepared positions. The Australian units in Darwin were ordered to conduct a fighting withdrawal, delaying the Japanese advance and bleeding them with every step. It was a brutal calculus, trading space for time and lives for days. The withdrawal began on the night of August 16th. Under cover of darkness, the surviving defenders slipped away from Darwin, moving south through the bush. Japanese patrols hunted them, but the Australians knew the country. They moved in small groups, using dry creek beds and scrubland for cover. Many didn't make it. Japanese troops were seasoned jungle fighters from Malaya and Burma, and they pressed the pursuit relentlessly. But enough escaped to reinforce the defensive line MacArthur was building. By August 20th, Darwin was firmly in Japanese hands. Engineers immediately began repairing the airfield and expanding it to accommodate land-based bombers and fighters. Within a week, Japanese aircraft were operating from Australian soil, striking targets deeper into the continent. The psychological impact was devastating. Radio Tokyo broadcast triumphant announcements in English, declaring that the liberation of Australia from Western imperialism had begun. Japanese leaflets dropped over Australian positions promised fair treatment to those who surrendered and death to those who resisted. The landings at Broome and Wyndham encountered less resistance, but achieved their objectives quickly. By the end of August, Japan controlled a continuous strip of territory across Australia's northern coast, approximately 100 miles deep. 3 airfields were operational. Supply ships were arriving daily. The invasion force was digging in, preparing for the expected Allied counterattack. But that counterattack wasn't coming. Not yet. MacArthur simply didn't have the forces. The Australian government, in a state of near panic, instituted emergency measures. Conscription was expanded to all able-bodied men. Factories converted to war production at a frantic pace. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. A defensive line was established across the narrow part of the continent, from Townsville on the east coast to just south of Broome on the west. Nearly 2,000 miles of trenches, obstacles, and fortified positions. This became known as the Brisbane Line, though officially the government denied any plan to abandon northern Australia. In Washington, the disaster triggered an immediate strategic reassessment. President Roosevelt had promised Churchill that Germany would remain the priority. Europe first, as the strategy was called. But with Australia under direct invasion and the Pacific Fleet still recovering from the disaster at Midway, pressure mounted to shift resources westward. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, argued forcefully that if Australia fell, Japan would control the entire southwest Pacific. The line to New Zealand would be cut. India would be threatened. The war could be lost before Europe was even secured. The compromise that emerged was painful for everyone. 2 divisions earmarked for Operation Torch, the planned invasion of North Africa, were diverted to Australia. Additional landing craft, artillery, and air units followed. But it would take months for these forces to arrive and become operational. In the meantime, Australia would have to hold with what it had. The Japanese, meanwhile, were consolidating their gains but facing challenges of their own. Supplying 70,000 troops across thousands of miles of ocean was an enormous logistical burden. Submarines, both American and increasingly Australian, began taking a toll on supply convoys. The distances involved meant that air cover was spotty, and Allied aircraft operating from bases in southern Australia and New Guinea were becoming bolder. Japan had seized territory, but holding it was proving costly. By October 1942, the front had largely stabilized. Japanese forces controlled the north. Allied forces held a defensive line across the center of the continent. Both sides were building up strength for the next phase. In Melbourne, now the operational capital with Canberra considered too vulnerable, Curtin's government faced mounting political pressure. Citizens in Sydney and Brisbane lived in fear of invasion. Some voices called for negotiation, for an armistice that would cede the north and save the south. But Curtin, his face gaunt with exhaustion, refused. "We will fight them in the center," he declared in a radio address. "We will fight them in the south. We will never surrender Australian soil to any invader." MacArthur, frustrated by the lack of resources and the defensive posture forced upon him, began planning for a counteroffensive. But he needed more troops, more ships, more aircraft. He needed time. And time was something the Japanese weren't willing to give. In November, Japanese forces launched a major push south from Darwin, attempting to break through the Allied defensive line and capture the town of Katherine. The Battle of Katherine lasted 3 weeks and became one of the bloodiest engagements in Australian history. Japanese infantry, supported by tanks and heavy artillery, smashed into Australian and American positions again and again. The defenders held, but barely. When the Japanese finally withdrew, having failed to break through, both sides had suffered catastrophic casualties. The battlefield was littered with the dead of 2 nations, and the war in Australia had taken on the character of the Western Front in World War I, a grinding, attritional stalemate. The global implications of the Australian invasion rippled outward. In Britain, Churchill faced harsh criticism for having left Australia vulnerable. The Dominion that had sent troops to die for the Empire in 2 world wars now fought alone against invasion, and Britain could offer little help. The political relationship would never fully recover. In the United States, public opinion shifted dramatically. Australia was an English-speaking democracy, and images of Australian cities under threat galvanized American support for the Pacific War. Roosevelt found himself with more political capital to allocate resources westward, but it came at a cost. Operation Torch was delayed until January 1943. The campaign in North Africa stretched longer, giving Germany time to reinforce. The carefully planned timeline for defeating Hitler was disrupted. In the Pacific, Japan's decision to invade Australia proved to be both its greatest victory and the beginning of its ultimate defeat. The invasion succeeded tactically. They held territory, they established bases, they demonstrated military superiority. But strategically, it was a trap. Every soldier in Australia was a soldier not available for defending other positions. Every ship bringing supplies to Darwin was a ship vulnerable to submarine attack. Every aircraft stationed on Australian airfields was an aircraft not available for the desperate battles developing in New Guinea and the Solomons. By early 1943, the Allies were finally ready to counterattack. The Americans had brought new fleet carriers into service: Essex, Lexington II, Yorktown II. MacArthur had 5 full divisions under his command, a mixture of American, Australian, and even a Free French unit. The Royal Australian Air Force, rebuilt and reinforced with American aircraft, had achieved rough parity in the skies over Central Australia. The offensive began in March 1943 with Operation Southern Storm. Allied forces struck not at the Japanese front lines, but at their logistics. Submarines hunted supply convoys with ruthless efficiency. Long-range bombers struck the airfields at Darwin and Broome. Commandos raided coastal installations. The goal wasn't to push the Japanese back immediately. That would be too costly. The goal was to starve them, to make their position untenable, to force them to withdraw or be isolated and destroyed. The campaign lasted through 1943 and into 1944. It was brutal, grinding warfare. Towns changed hands multiple times. Both sides committed atrocities in the heat of battle and the frustration of stalemate. The Japanese, sensing their position deteriorating, fought with ferocious determination. But by mid-1944, it was clear that they could no longer hold Northern Australia. American industrial production had reached full capacity. For every ship Japan lost, America built 3. For every aircraft destroyed, 5 more appeared. The mathematics of war were inexorable. The final Japanese withdrawal from Australian soil came in August 1944, exactly 2 years after the invasion began. It was conducted in stages, a skillful retreat that preserved most of the invasion force but left behind shattered towns, scorched earth, and thousands of graves. Darwin, when Australian troops finally reclaimed it, was virtually unrecognizable, a bombed-out shell of its former self. The human cost was staggering. Australia lost over 40,000 military personnel killed and twice that number wounded. Civilian casualties from bombing, Japanese occupation, and the chaos of war numbered in the thousands. The economic devastation set the country back a generation. But Australia had survived. It had fought on its own soil and won, though the victory was anything but clean. For Japan, the invasion of Australia proved to be a strategic disaster. The resources committed to the operation came at the expense of defending the island chains that formed their defensive perimeter. While troops were tied down in the Australian outback, American forces island-hopped across the Pacific, reclaiming Tarawa, the Marshalls, and Saipan with less Japanese resistance than in our timeline. The path to Japan itself opened earlier, and with fewer obstacles. The war in Europe was affected as well. The delayed operations in North Africa meant that the invasion of Italy came later, in late 1943 rather than mid-1943. D-Day, originally planned for June 1944, was pushed to September 1944. The war in Europe lasted longer, giving the Soviet Union more time to advance westward. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, Soviet forces occupied more of Central Europe than in our timeline, setting the stage for a more extensive Cold War divide. The atomic bombs that ended the war fell on schedule. Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki on August 9. Japan surrendered on August 15, exactly 3 years after their troops had first landed on Australian beaches. The symmetry was not lost on historians. Post-war Australia emerged as a changed nation. The British connection, so long the foundation of Australian identity and security, had been revealed as inadequate. Australia looked instead to America and to itself. Defense spending remained high. Immigration was encouraged to build population. The economy was restructured with an eye toward self-sufficiency. The scars of invasion, physical and psychological, would take generations to heal. In the decades that followed, historians debated the what-ifs within this what-if. Could Japan have won if they had committed even more resources? Could Australia have stopped the invasion entirely with better preparation? The truth, as always, was complex. The invasion of Australia was a gamble born of desperation and opportunity, and it nearly paid off. But nearly isn't enough in war. Veterans of the campaign, both Australian and Japanese, carried their memories to the grave. They remembered the red dust of the outback turned to mud with blood. They remembered the sound of artillery in the night and the silence afterward. They remembered friends lost, youth spent, and a war that came to a continent that had never truly expected to fight for its own survival on its own soil. In the end, the invasion of Australia became a footnote to the larger story of World War II, a brutal, costly campaign that affected the war's trajectory but did not change its ultimate outcome. Japan was always going to lose, once America's industrial might was fully mobilized. The question was never if, but when, and at what cost. Australia paid that cost in full, and then some. But it survived, transformed, forever marked by the war that came to its shores and the 2 years when its very existence hung in the balance. The last Japanese soldier withdrew from Australian soil on August 28, 1944. An Australian flag was raised over Darwin the following morning. And somewhere in the vast emptiness of the Northern Territory, a single rifle remained half buried in the red earth, a memorial to all those who fought in a war that should never have come to Australia, but did, and in doing so changed everything. History is written by choices made in moments of crisis, and sometimes those choices lead us down paths we never imagined we would walk.